On August 2, 1945, just 14 days before Japan's capitulation, the most senior Japanese military officer taken prisoner during the Pacific Campaign was captured on Morotai Island in Dutch New Guinea. What rendered this event extraordinary was that his captors belonged to the 93rd Infantry Division's 25th Infantry Regiment. Among the division's 14,000 personnel, more than 90% were African Americans. The narrative of the 93rd represents a triumph over adversity. While most military formations face only enemy opposition, the 93rd confronted racial animosity at home, a predominantly white military hierarchy that rejected their participation, and commanders reluctant to lead them. Most challenging was combating the pervasive notion that black servicemen in World War II lacked the capacity for battlefield excellence. The 93rd Infantry Division originated as an all-black formation during the First World War, demonstrating its worth in brutal French engagements. However, concerns existed regarding what might occur with 20,000 armed African Americans assembled together. The primary uncertainties concerned their fighting ability and willingness to engage in combat. Questions arose about their obedience to white officers during battle. Initially, thousands of 93rd personnel found themselves relegated to menial labor within the Army. For reasons unknown, the segregated, white-controlled U.S. Army viewed the 93rd similarly to how the British and French regarded American forces generally. Could any American, irrespective of race, effectively fight and prevail in European warfare? Upon reaching France, the American Expeditionary Force nearly found itself distributed among British and French command structures, but General John J. Pershing refused. Some units did serve under British command, while black American formations operated under French leadership. After proving their capabilities, the U.S. Army remained uncertain about the 93rd's employment. Black officers were typically considered incompetent, and no white officer desired the assignment. The French showed no such reluctance. They enthusiastically accepted the 93rd, but distributed its 4 regiments among 3 French divisions. The 369th Regiment joined the 161st Division, the 370th Regiment went to the 26th Division, and the 371st and 372nd Regiments were assigned to the 157th Colonial Division. From that moment forward, these 4 regiments maintained only their American uniforms as connection to their homeland. They consumed French rations, employed French weaponry, utilized French military doctrine, and likely acquired considerable French language skills. Though their uniforms remained American, they wore French-style, blue-tinted Adrian helmets. The 93rd's divisional insignia subsequently became the silhouetted Adrian helmet emblem within a black circle. This earned them the nickname Blue Helmet Division. Throughout World War I, no other American division sustained as many consecutive days of direct combat as the 4 regiments comprising the 93rd. The 369th achieved 191 days, surpassing any comparable white unit by 1 week. The soldiers earned French Croix de Guerre decorations, proving their capabilities. 23 years later, the 93rd would face the same challenges again. During World War II, the U.S. Army deployed 68 infantry divisions. Standard personnel strength ranged between 14,000 and 18,000 soldiers per division. By early December 1941, African American publications, alongside some white counterparts, campaigned for expanded black participation in the anticipated conflict. The U.S. Army clearly articulated its racial integration position. Social integration constituted a civilian sociological matter to resolve. Military integration was never intended as a military concern. Regarding the expected war, the Army initially planned 4 all-black divisions, but ultimately only half materialized. One division, the 92nd, deployed to Italy, while the other, the 93rd, served in the Pacific Theater. Another division, designated as the 2nd Cavalry Division, reached Oran, Algeria, on March 9, 1944. Upon arrival, it was disbanded and distributed in segments as support units to larger operations, primarily in non-combat roles. The 92nd and 93rd would demonstrate African American infantry capabilities. Although black units participated in the American Revolutionary War and Civil War, The modern era of African American soldiers commenced in 1892. Fort Huachuca, Arizona, sits in the state's south-central Sierra Vista mountain region within 20 miles of the Mexican border. Historically, Fort Huachuca served as a western frontier outpost positioned for intervention against renegade Indians and roaming bandits, whether Mexican or American. The first Army unit stationed at this isolated post was the 24th Infantry Regiment colored in 1892. Subsequently came the 25th Infantry, followed by the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments. All four were African American or colored units. By 1939, the primary residents at Fort Huachuca were the 10th Cavalry and 25th Infantry. When the 93rd was activated there for military training on May 15, 1942, their instructors and drill sergeants came from the 24th Infantry Regiment. As a pre-World War II military installation, Fort Huachuca's population rarely exceeded 800, but this number was about to increase dramatically. Fort Huachuca's remote, isolated location seemed perfect for African American units, as the Army believed there would be less racial tension with nearby civilian populations. The Army was mistaken. Violent confrontations, often fatal, between black and white soldiers and civilians occurred regularly. Like all Army installations of that era, Fort Huachuca was segregated, including medical care. 2 hospitals operated, one exclusively for white patients and another for black. The latter facility contained nearly 950 patient beds, making it America's largest African American hospital staffed entirely by African American medical personnel. Naturally, separate barracks, mess halls, and service clubs existed for officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted personnel of both races. Soldiers in the 93rd also brought just over 900 dependents, wives, children, and some parents. Complaints were abundant. One soldier in the 369th told a visiting black general, "I'm essentially fighting slavery here, sir," while another stated, "The Jim Crow treatment of our unit here must end." While enlisted personnel were black, most officers were white, and assignment to command a black unit was generally considered the kiss of death for white officers. The appointed division commander was 55-year-old Major General Charles P. Hall, a 1911 West Point graduate and veteran of the 2nd Infantry Division in World War I. Hall was the first of 4 commanders during the 93rd's nearly 4-year existence. His responsibility was leading the 93rd through 17 weeks of basic training, then any required advanced training, a task most contemporaries did not envy. Hall's selection partly resulted from his Mississippi birth and upbringing. Because he originated from the Deep South, many military superiors believed he could relate to African American soldiers better than others considered for the position. Again, the Army was wrong. The 93rd Division Artillery Commander, Brigadier General William Spence, was another Southerner with North Carolina roots who received his assignment under similar circumstances. Hall's newly formed division consisted primarily of 14,000 enlisted men. Among its 883 officers, approximately half of whom were black, were first and second lieutenants. When one new black lieutenant reported to his white company commander, the captain refused to return the younger officer's salute. "I hate niggers," was the captain's only response. Before World War II's outbreak, the U.S. Army revised its organizational structure to the triangular concept, meaning divisions contained 3 regiments compared to 4 during World War I. With this streamlined approach, the 93rd Division now had 3 regiments, the 25th, 368th, and 369th. While the 25th previously existed as a regular Army regiment, the 368th was originally the 8th Infantry Regiment of the Illinois Army National Guard. The newly formed 369th was composed mostly of draftees. Each regiment contained 3 battalions. Brigadier General Spence's field artillery included 4 battalions, the 593rd, 594th, 595th, and 596th, each with 12 guns, primarily 105 mm howitzers. Additionally, there were the 93rd Quartermaster Battalion, 318th Engineer Combat Battalion, 318th Medical Battalion, 793rd Light Maintenance Ordnance Company, 93rd Signal Company, 93rd Cavalry Reconnaissance Troop, a military police platoon, and other support units. Regarding personnel, the Blue Helmet Division resembled most other infantry divisions on paper: 60% draftees, 26% volunteers, and 14% transferred veterans. Following the Army's standardized instruction schedule, the 93rd's initial 17 weeks of training included basic soldiering, learning to march, perform manual of arms and close order drill, adjust to barracks life and military discipline. Then came 13 weeks of training in infantry, artillery, or other specialties. Upon achieving proficiency, the division was evaluated and advanced to maneuver division status. This meant a 14-week encounter with other divisions in staged war games. Following that came the final 8 weeks of specialized training focusing on the division's potential deployment destination. From the beginning, the 93rd was burdened with discriminations, trials, and tribulations. The Army's inductee test for military capabilities was heavily biased against black soldiers generally and the 93rd specifically. The Army General Classification Test (AGCT) established standards for any recruit's Army career direction. This test's basics measured reading and comprehension levels. Class 1 represented the highest scores. Class 5 was the lowest. The 93rd appeared doomed before progressing beyond basic training, as most members had received substandard education. Among the 14,000 men within the 93rd, only 0.1% achieved Class 1, while 45% of the division was rated Class 5. Within white divisions of similar experience, 6.6% were rated Class 1 and 8.5% were at Class 5. These prejudices even affected the division's 585 black lieutenants. To become a commissioned officer, one either needed a college degree, which few blacks possessed at the time, or had graduated from Officers Candidate School (OCS). The higher-ranking black officers, captains and majors, were mostly found among the medical or chaplain corps. When such officers demonstrated exceptional leadership in education and were skilled enough for advancement, many were transferred out. Regarding their white counterparts assigned to the 93rd, some being West Point graduates, those lieutenants resented their assignment. Many could not transfer away from Fort Huachuca quickly enough. Thus, maintaining qualified, competent junior officer leadership in the 93rd became challenging. The Army wasn't the only institution with a race problem. The Marines did not accept African Americans, and the Navy accepted almost none between the world wars. In the late 1930s, blacks could join the Navy but could serve only as mess stewards. Once war erupted, the American press, along with some progressive white newspapers, began highlighting that blacks were not given fair treatment by the military, especially considering deficiencies in education. One argument involved how well educated the typical Russian peasant soldier holding the Nazi advance at bay in western Russia was. Nobody really knew how educated the typical Japanese soldier in the Pacific was, but he was fighting extremely well. In October 1942, Major General Hall, the 93rd's commander, was promoted upward and replaced by Major General Fred W. Miller. His direct instruction to his staff was to minimize the duties and responsibilities of the division's black soldiers. At one point, men of the 93rd wanted to change their division patch from the French Adrian helmet silhouette to something more American. One idea considered was a rattlesnake, since they were plentiful around their Arizona home. Another was an outline of Arizona State. In a division-wide vote, the majority chose a growling Black Panther. The division's executive officer, Brigadier General Allison J. Barnett, also approved the Black Panther symbol, but higher headquarters overruled the vote, insisting that the Adrian helmet remain to designate the division's World War I heritage. The 93rd began its 17-week basic training program in Arizona's heat. Then came the interdivisional 13-week coordinated unit sessions. Arizona Governor Sidney Osborne had a less than brilliant idea. When the division was not training, perhaps it could be used to pick cotton in Pima and Maricopa counties, since many able-bodied field hands were serving in military service or war industries. While President Roosevelt thought the idea had merit, it was eventually rejected. As one sociologist stated, the armed forces should bend over backwards to see that soldiers are not the first soldiers to be used as farmers, and that of all things, they should not be assigned to pick cotton, which epitomizes to many a return to slavery status. After receiving minimum basic training, Then participating in interdivisional war games, the 93rd departed on April 3, 1943, for the large-scale 1943 Louisiana maneuvers. During that time, the other Black Division, the 92nd, moved into the vacated Fort Huachuca. For 3 months, the Blue Army and Red Army pursued each other across swamps, up and down hills, and through towns. Much animosity existed between white units in the 93rd, and fights frequently erupted. If military police intervened, it was assumed that the 93rd started it all and received punitive actions at some level. A point came when 125 soldiers within the 93rd collected more than 100 rifles and hid them for any unexpected racial confrontation. Fortunately, that did not occur. Umpires evaluated every aspect of the maneuvers. According to the 93rd Division's commander, Major General Fred W. Miller, the 93rd performed rather well, nothing too exceptional, nothing too exceptionally poor. The 3rd Army commander, Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, agreed the 93rd was well led and performed adequately. America's then highest-ranking African-American general, Brigadier General Benjamin Davis, SR, also praised the 93rd's performance. The 93rd had one more round before proving itself prepared for overseas deployment. The 93rd moved west into the Southern California Mojave Desert Training Center that bordered western Arizona. This range, covering 18,000 square miles, was used for final training of divisions prior to overseas shipment. Within this desert training area were numerous camps. The 93rd moved into a camp built specifically for their convenience at Charleston, Arizona, specially established as a segregated camp. For months, the 93rd was led to believe it was being prepared for desert warfare, while what many thought was a high-level conspiracy was in play. America's top officer, Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, was never a supporter of an integrated army. One level below Marshall was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces. This 61-year-old 1904 West Point graduate had the penultimate word on whether Army units were ready for combat operations. His preference was to see African American divisions broken up and no more than regimental-sized subunits be parceled out to other units. Almost unanimously, American military leaders were dubious of what any sizable African American infantry unit could achieve. Further down the chain of command was 59-year-old Lieutenant General Millard F. Arman, a 1912 West Point graduate. In 1916, he was among the first Army Air Corps pilots. By late January 1942, he was Chief of Staff of the Army Air Forces and ended up managing the Army's ground war operations across the South Pacific while the 93rd was still training in the Mojave Desert. In early 1944, he told his superiors he needed another infantry division, and its color made no difference to him. At this time, Douglas MacArthur was coming under fire from his boss, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. As Commander-in-Chief, Roosevelt was pressured into answering more and more inquiries from the African American and white press. Why weren't more black combat units in the war? By January 1944, it was decided the 93rd Division would be going off to war. The 93rd was loaded onto troop trains heading to California. Just east of San Francisco was the city of Pittsburgh with its bustling Camp Stoneman replacement depot. Upon arrival, the 93rd learned that it was headed not for the desert but to the Pacific Theater. Leading them was their new commander, 48-year-old Major General Raymond G. Lehman of Minnesota, a World War I veteran. Under intense pressure back home for the commitment of black troops to combat, the 93rd would soon ship out for Guadalcanal. In February and March 1944, elements of the 93rd began arriving on Guadalcanal, where major fighting had ended more than a year earlier. But scattered remnants of Japanese resistors remained who could make life interesting for the Americans. No sooner had the 93rd arrived on Guadalcanal than it was disassembled, and its various components were shipped to other locations under XIV Corps Commander Major General Oscar W. Griswold. Remaining on Guadalcanal were the 25th Infantry Regiment, one Field Artillery Battalion, and a section from the Medical Battalion. The 368th Infantry Regiment, 594th Field Artillery Battalion, and another group of medical personnel ended up at Bonica in the Russell Islands. the 369th Infantry Regiment, 595th Field Artillery Battalion, and other selected groups landed in the New Georgia Island Group. Other elements of the 93rd were sent to Wake Island, where there was little combat. A separate all-black regiment, the 24th, with whom the 93rd Division had shared space at Fort Huachuca, had been on Guadalcanal since August 1943. Most black troops were relegated to service duties such as improving bivouac areas, building roadways, or working as stevedores, dock workers, unloading and reloading ships. If time permitted, once their chores were done, the 24th joined with the 25th Infantry Regiment for brief courses in jungle fighting and survival. Regarding the 25th, they too were given little to do but hard, menial labor and guard duty along the perimeter of their bivouac areas at night, with rare forays into the jungle on combat patrols. Intermittent Japanese air raids provided the only excitement. The black troops were told the same story by the army. The manual jobs they were performing were necessary and would keep them physically fit for actual combat. But the 93rd despaired of ever seeing combat. It remained a scattered, disjointed division for nearly 14 months. Their baptism of fire would come on Bougainville, part of the Solomon Islands. The fight for Bougainville had been taking place sporadically since November 1, 1943, against Japanese soldiers who hid out in the jungle after first fighting against the U.S. Marine Corps 3rd Division. On January 12, 1944, the Army's 23rd Infantry Division, also known as the American Division, took over from the Marines. In late March 1944, the 25th Infantry Regiment was sent from Guadalcanal to Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville's southern end to join America's three regiments, the 164th, 182nd, and 132nd. Each battalion of the 25th would be attached to an American regiment and given more extensive schooling in jungle warfare. The terrain and climate were far different from the California desert in which the unit had previously trained. Also present was the 1st Battalion of the 24th Regiment, attached to the 132nd. Based from a bivouac area just off the Torquena airstrip, the three battalions of the 25th Regiment commenced field operations with their American counterparts from squad to platoon to company-sized patrols. Later, many 25th veterans would vividly recall the stench of rotting jungle vegetation and decaying animals and humans. Many wounded or ill Japanese soldiers who could not keep up with their comrades would climb a banyan tree and tie themselves to it. Essentially, they became snipers locked in place and attached to the tree. Even if not shooting an American, many snipers would die in those trees without being discovered. Eased into combat, the 25th soon found its footing and began to perform like a seasoned unit. On March 31st, during attacks on Hills 500 and 501, Private James H. O'Banner became the first enlisted man of the 93rd Division to kill an enemy soldier. The worst day for the 25th Regiment on Bougainville was April 7, 1944. On that day, 180 soldiers of the 3rd Battalion's Company K followed their white captain, James J. Curran, on a special patrol. This particular adventure was the 25th's first company-size operation almost entirely on its own. It was viewed as such a major step forward for the regiment, if not for the 93rd Division as well, that two Army Signal Corps photographers went along to document the event. Another guest was Captain William A. Crutcher's artillery spotter from the 93rd's 593rd Field Artillery. Of this entire group of 180 men, only one was an experienced combat veteran, the White Sergeant Ralph Broden of the Americans' 164th Regiment. The mission focused on blocking a trail lying 3,000 yards beyond America's perimeter. It was a path long recognized as being used by the Japanese. Expecting to encounter some of the enemy, Curran's company went out well prepared. 9-bar Browning automatic riflemen were part of the patrol, along with 4 .30-caliber machine guns, 1 60mm mortar, and 2 SCR-300 radios. Setting out on the morning of April 6th, Curran advanced his company with the 1st platoon as point. The 2nd platoon was divided between the two flanks. The 3rd platoon, led by the company's second-in-command, Black Lieutenant Oscar Davenport, brought up the rear. Reaching a point about 2,000 yards from their line of departure, Company K found an abandoned enemy aid station. After securing the find, Kern had the first platoon split into finger patrols and move farther forward. Within minutes, enemy fire was received. Then it all dissolved into chaos. Survivors would claim at least 3 enemy killed in that initial exchange of gunfire, during which the 3 platoons commenced firing in every direction. The jungle vegetation was so thick and heavily overgrown that the 3 platoons could not see one another, let alone at whom they were shooting or from where the shooting was coming. Kern radioed Battalion Commander Colonel Everett M. Yan for instructions and was told to reel in his company, fall back 300 yards, regroup, and make a more coordinated advance. That, however, would never happen. Some Japanese were yelling out orders in English that some of Company K thought were legitimate ceasefire orders. One Company K soldier, James Graham, said he shot a Japanese soldier up close and hit him dead center of his chest. The dying Japanese soldier said in coherent English, "You got me." Lieutenant Davenport went forward in an attempt to regain order at the center of the firing, only to be killed when he paused to help a wounded comrade. 9 others were also killed. Survivors of the skirmish would testify that the only strong, stand-up person throughout the 40-minute firefight was Sergeant Ralph Broden, who went about rallying soldiers and pointing them in the right direction to either shoot or withdraw. He constantly exposed himself to enemy fire and somehow was physically unscathed by it all. The men of Company K then realized that Captain Kern, his radio man, and the company's first sergeant were nowhere to be found. By then, Captain Crutcher was calling in precise artillery concentration, and the 593rd dropped 24 rounds on what was believed to be the enemy's concentrated gathering site. By 5:30 p.m., survivors brought back 20 wounded, leaving 10 comrades dead where they fell. If not for Sergeant Broden's cool leadership, those numbers would have increased dramatically. Also left behind were 1 radio, 1 machine gun, 1 mortar with all its rounds, 18 M1 rifles, and 3 carbines, plus a considerable amount of discarded personal equipment. The Signal Corps photographers never took a single picture, or at least none that were ever made public. Between April 14th and May 2nd, 1944, the Infantry Division conducted what it thought was a thorough, fair, unbiased, non-bigoted investigation into the debacle. Upon testimony of the survivors, it was determined that Company K encountered no more than 24 enemy soldiers, and Captain Kern apparently fled the field of battle with the first sergeant following closely. Many testified they heard shouted commands in English coming from the direction of the enemy. The soldiers had no idea who was giving legitimate orders. Regarding the dead left behind on April 7th, a patrol by the 25th Company L, led by Lieutenant Reginald Hall, went out the next day to retrieve the bodies. Along the way, 1 soldier drowned crossing a river. Coming within 75 yards of the killing field, another Company L soldier died in an ambush. The patrol halted there and then returned to base empty-handed. The following day, Black Lieutenant Abner E. Jackson took 40 soldiers out on a second attempt. Upon reaching the 2-day-old corpses, 30 of Jackson's men refused to touch the dead. Jackson, 2 medics, and 2 sergeants bagged the dead in mattress covers. Only then would the 40 carry them back. They also reclaimed all the discarded weapons, ammunition, and equipment they could find. In the end, throughout the investigation, Kern had his own personal bodyguard. Once the case was settled, he was transferred out, still a captain. 2 black lieutenants were judged lacking in leadership qualities and shipped out as well. From the enlisted ranks, Isaiah Adams and Leroy Morgan were charged and found guilty of disobeying orders. Whose orders those may have been, whether from English-speaking Japanese or other Americans, remains unknown. Both Adams and Morgan were returned stateside. No matter what flawed, limited, biased, or prejudiced evidence came before ex-IV Corps Commander Oscar Griswold, he agreed with it. He proclaimed the 25th had too little individual and unit jungle training. The junior grade black officers were poor examples to follow, and, lacking initiative, were not motivated to do better. Overall, Griswold said that the 25th Infantry Regiment, reflective of the 93rd in total, needed improvement. The 93rd's commander, Major General Raymond G. Lehman, disagreed with Griswold's assessment. Lieutenant Colonel Yan sided with Lehman. The investigation was stacked against the 25th and the 93rd as well, from start to finish. Corps and Division rated the 25th's performance as only fair, but none of the negative statements showed the true heart and soul of the 93rd. For example, in mid-April 1944, a 15-man patrol from the 25th came upon a group of Japanese with well over twice their number and outfitted with machine guns. Opposing those machine guns was Private Isaac Sherman with his bar. In the opening exchange of gunfire, Sherman was wounded in the neck. That was the first of 4 wounds he received, while never relenting in the use of his weapon. During the unit's withdrawal, he kept firing away for 600 yards. By then, he was so weak from loss of blood that he collapsed. His comrades carried him back to recover from his wounds. In another action on May 17, 1944, the 25th 2nd Lieutenant Charles P. Collins led a patrol on Bougainville along with a contingent of men from the 93rd Cavalry Reconnaissance Troop. Overwhelmed by superior enemy firepower in numbers, 3 troopers were killed outright. 3 others were wounded but remained somewhat ambulatory. Collins became the 4th wounded and was temporarily blinded as well. The remaining men withdrew, believing those left behind had been killed and their bodies not recoverable. In fact, Staff Sergeant Rothschild Webb collected all those wounded. Under his guidance, the group hid out for 3 days in heavily enemy-infested surroundings until they reached their own lines. For their heroics, Webb and Sherman would receive Silver Star medals. By late summer 1944, 2 events impacted the 93rd Division. Its commander, Major General Lehman, became ill and was replaced by 59-year-old Major General Harry H. Johnson, a 1916 graduate of Texas A&M and a World War I veteran of the 36th Infantry Division. For a brief period, Johnson had commanded the 2nd Cavalry Division, the African-American division that did not last long upon reaching Algeria. From Italy, Johnson was sent to the Pacific with special instructions from his boss, General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur wanted the 93rd shaped into a real fighting division with no doubts about its capabilities. The second event was the positive reaction of the American public to articles found in newspapers. Articles such as those written by 51-year-old Walter F. White, Executive Secretary of the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, who took notice of the struggles of the men serving in the 93rd. White was also a War Department accredited war correspondent. He could go anywhere the U.S. Army would allow him to report on the war. With growing support of white Americans, the voices of African Americans highlighting the dilemmas facing the 93rd were becoming heard, creating a challenge for the Army to rectify the situation in the Pacific. With Bougainville secured, in November 1944, the 25th Regiment was assigned to Finchefin, New Guinea, to strengthen U.S. defenses there, and in December 1944, the 24th Regiment departed Bougainville and headed to Saipan and Tinian to again perform mopping-up operations and garrison duties. But what was in store for the 93rd Division? The answer lay in the Halmahera Island group of eastern Indonesia's Maluku Islands. Between Indonesia, formerly the Dutch East Indies, and West Papua lies the K-shaped island of Halmahera. By the summer of 1944, this 6,860 square mile island was known to be the home of 30,000 to 40,000 Japanese soldiers along with some advanced airfields. Douglas MacArthur's ultimate goal in the Pacific was a grandiose return to the Philippines. A major stepping stone in that direction was Morotai Island, 70 miles north of Halmahera in eastern Indonesia's Maluku Islands. Morotai was 700 square miles of beautiful tropical paradise with lush jungles, rugged mountains, and white sand beaches. But on the whole, the Japanese did not think much of Morotai, 50 miles long by 26 miles wide. Although the landscape was beautiful, when the Japanese invaded it in 1942, they found a population of 9,000 living on the fringes of mountainous jungles with a wide variety of vegetation. Malaria was rampant, and the flattest piece of real estate was in the southwest corner called the Dariba Plains. Thinking it could make a useful landing strip for Japanese planes, it became a foolish concept. The plains flooded excessively during the rainy season, and it took too much time, energy, resources, expenditures, and manpower to keep the airfield operational. The larger neighboring Halmahera Island proved a far better setting for over half a dozen airfields and was easier to defend. so the Imperial Japanese Army fortified it and left only a token presence of 600 to 800 soldiers on Morotai, whose entire existence was dependent upon the sea lifeline to Halmahera. A constant stream of small boats, most often described as barges, kept going back and forth, providing whatever Major Takanobu Kashima needed to sustain his 2nd Provisional Raider Unit. If that lifeline were ever cut, those on Morotai would be abandoned. The thick vegetation and craggy peaks were conducive for bands of Japanese resistors who could hide and live off the land indefinitely if they were cut off from supplies from Halmahera. MacArthur's scheme was to completely bypass Halmahera and capture Morotai, which lay 850 miles south and a bit east of the southern tip of Mindanao in the Philippine Islands. Knowing how weak and poorly defended Morotai was, he felt an invasion would be relatively easy and, more importantly, would bring him closer to the Philippines. By mid-July 1944, proposals were being discussed on how to seize the island. MacArthur envisioned filling the island with 60,000 Allied military personnel, vastly improving what harbors existed, installing fuel oil storage tanks, then creating an airstrip called Wamadrome at P2 Airfield. A hospital system that could accommodate 1,900 patients would also be built. On August 15, 1944, MacArthur gave the order to commence what was codenamed Operation Tradewind with She Corps Commander Lieutenant General Charles P. Hall, the former commander of the 93rd, in charge of it. More than 40,000 U.S. Army soldiers, supported by U.S. and Australian naval and air forces, prepared to hit the island. Operation Tradewind, supported by carrier planes of the Navy's 3rd and 7th Fleets, as well as fighter bombers of the 5th Army Air Force and the RAAF's 80th Fighter Wing, was scheduled for September 15, 1944. The U.S. Army's 31st Dixie Infantry Division, which consisted of the 124th, 155th, and 167th Infantry Regiments, all part of the Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi National Guard, would be the main invasion force. At the time the 31st Infantry Division stormed ashore, Major Kawashima was in charge of the Japanese garrison. He was specifically instructed by his superiors on Halmahera to withdraw into the island's interior and not challenge the Americans on the landing beaches. He was then to dissolve his force into smaller groups ranging from a dozen to 2 dozen, but nothing larger than 50 in any single locale. After the Americans came ashore and began hunting for the defenders, life became more and more intolerable for the Japanese. The U.S. Navy's 40 PT Boat Task Force 701.2, which included patrol boat squadrons 9, 10, 18, and 33, kept intercepting barges. The Americans also used loudspeakers to urge, in Japanese, Nippon soldiers to surrender. It met with some success, and several of the enemy, ragged and hungry, gave themselves up. The arrogant Colonel Kasuuchi, commander of the 211th Infantry Regiment, took over Morotai's defenses on October 12, 1944. In addition to his men, there was a mixture of a few other units, including a group of Japanese Army military police known as the Kempeitai. The Kempeitai were as bad or worse than Nazi Germany's SS and Gestapo, more secretive, vicious, and lacking in humanity and morals. Little is known of Kasuuchi, who was, according to tales told by those who surrendered, despised by those under his command. He may have grown up heavily steeped in the samurai warlord traditions of an older Japanese era, and claimed the privileges of the upper class even while his men suffered. He always demanded better living arrangements and more and better food whenever it became available. From the outset, it seems that the 93rd Infantry Division may never have been considered for any part of the action. Finally, on April 4, 1945, nearly 8 months after Operation Tradewind was launched, the decision was made to bring the 93rd ashore at Morotai. The men of the Blue Helmet Division had almost given up hope that they would ever see action and have the opportunity to prove that they were just as good as any all-white division. They almost didn't get the chance. Nelson Peary, a black platoon leader in Company C of the 93rd, recalled that the tension between his unit and the 31st Dixie Division nearly erupted into a race war. While the 93rd was sailing to Morotai, a black sailor on the transport ship mentioned that the 31st, which the 93rd was coming in to relieve, was the most damnable set of Ku Kluxers ever seen. The 31st said they're gonna lynch any black man looked cross-eyed at the women Army nurses. The landing craft approached the beach. Peary said that he could see a group of people on the shore. A group of white MPs from the Dixie Division, some holding rifles, a group of nurses from the hospital that had been established nearby, and the most forlorn group of soldiers from a water filtration unit I had ever seen. Once on the beach, Peary was approached by one of the forlorn black soldiers who seemed overjoyed to see him. "I'm glad to see a black man with a rifle." "What's the matter, man?" a surprised Peary replied. "We've been catching hell here. These white soldiers got all the guns. They're the military police and they've been beating us up." Peary realized that the rumor he had heard on the boat was true. "So they want to lynch somebody," he said. I turned to the men filing out of the landing craft. "Looks like the Dixie boys been giving these men a hard time." Peary's platoon was having none of it. The men loaded their rifles and clicked off the safeties, ready for whatever might come. The superheated atmosphere was about to burst into flames. The nurses looked worried, and the white MPs appeared agitated and ready for a brawl. A nervous Peary said, "This was worse than combat. We greatly outnumbered them, but we were bunched together for a slaughter." The officers on deck talked together nervously. Behind them, the sailors glanced around for cover. The white soldiers shifted their weapons. We were more than they had bargained for. I turned my back on them and called to the section, "Okay, men, fall in here." His men did as ordered, but a drunken white MP started toward the group, getting ready to unholster his .45. But he stopped when he saw the black soldier's weapons brought up to firing position and aimed at him. "The nurses screamed and ran for the hospital tents," said Peary. The white soldiers scattered for cover. Men from Company C ran from the landing craft. Captain Williams, the commander of Company C, ran between the groups. Pulling his .45 from its holster, he shouted for attention. Our men lowered their rifles and snapped to. The terrified white soldier did not move. Captain Williams ordered the drunken white soldier to get back to his company. The soldier obeyed. The 368th 1st Battalion commander arrived on the scene, and he and Williams held a brief conference. Soon the situation was defused, and the white soldiers, grumbling, departed the scene. We marched to the edge of the swamp that the commander of the 31st had designated our bivouac area, said Peary. But all was not sweetness and light. Tension rose immediately between the white MPs and our soldiers, he noted. Arrests and fights between them occurred almost daily. Just as the tension reached the flashpoint, our division headquarters moved to the island. General Johnson, our new commanding officer and the senior officer on the island, took command. Our military police replaced those of the Dixie Division, and the bottom rail went to the top. A few cracked heads, and the Dixie boys accepted the black MPs. Before any serious trouble developed, the 31st left for the invasion of the Philippines. The 93rd's arrival did not mean an immediate combat role. The men found the usual tasks awaiting them: guard duty, unloading ships, and stacking piles of supplies. Only this time, their Australian counterparts worked alongside them, virtually shoulder to shoulder. At last, it came time for combat. From the island's southwest corner, the 93rd's 3 regiments would conduct patrols lasting from 2 to 3 weeks at a time, seeking straggling Japanese holdouts. Their areas of concentration were Guadalcanal, Libano, and Sopi. One area of particular interest was where the River Tijo emptied into the Pacific. It was the chosen landing site for supply barges coming from Halmahera Island. During an April 15, 1945 patrol, men of the 369th Regiment eliminated 4 Japanese in a shootout. 6 days later, the 369th brought in the 93rd's first prisoner of war. All the while, the Imperial Japanese Navy kept up an intermittent run of barges full of supplies and reinforcements to Morotai. It seemed Uchi's numbers may have been on the increase. On May 13th, U.S. Navy PT boats chased 4 Japanese barges that had left Halmahera and were heading for Morotai. 2 were destroyed en route, a third was hit just short of Morotai, and the 4th landed, was unloaded, and was hidden in the cove of the Tijo River outlet. A 25th Regiment patrol eventually found and destroyed it. On that same day, a patrol from the 25th 3rd Battalion was just north of Libano when it came upon 8 well-equipped Japanese who may have been connected to the recently found barge. It was a successful hunt for those of the 3rd Battalion, but in June the 25th would be moved to the Green Islands, where once again they would be used primarily in a service and security role. On May 24th, Company F of the 368th Regiment sent out a patrol led by Lieutenant Richard L. Crawford. Their starting point was the well-known streambed of the Tijo River. Moving inland, Crawford's 12-man patrol quickly found and began tracking a set of footprints that followed the stream. 2 miles later, the footprints turned away from the water and went up a rocky ridge onto a jungle-covered hill. Carrying on stealthily, Crawford's patrol spotted 7 unsuspecting Japanese soldiers resting. All wore newly issued, immaculate uniforms. Only one carried a rifle, while the others had just pistols. From their hiding place, Crawford and his men watched as one soldier spent a considerable amount of time looking into a handheld mirror while grooming his beard. The Japanese seemed more like they were preparing for a parade than worried about the possibility of being ambushed. Crawford's patrol opened fire, killing 6. The 7th got away, but a blood trail leading into the jungle showed that he had been wounded. Through documents on the bodies, it was determined that these soldiers were indeed Kempe Tai. On July 11, another Crawford-led patrol was again in the Tijo River area. This 12-man patrol was to spend 2 weeks in the vicinity scouting for Japanese, especially Colonel Uchi. On their last day, they found a wounded Japanese soldier and took him prisoner. For the aid, comfort, and rations given him, he was happy to give up the location of a nearby camp where Uchi had his headquarters. The patrol found a 3-hut camp in a clearing occupied by 10 or 12 Japanese. A brief firefight netted 1 enemy dead, at least 6 wounded, and the rest running for their lives. They left behind ample piles of rice, blankets, ammunition, and grenades. Another 2 days of patrolling netted nothing. On August 2nd, Crawford's men heard wood being chopped. Homing in on the sound, they found a 4-hut camp with a number of Japanese napping. Another half-dozen had just deposited boxes of supplies they had carried in and were heading downhill to swim in the river. Positioning his patrol to cover both camp and swimmers, Crawford tried talking the bathers into surrendering. They refused and ran off into the jungle. At the camp, the rest of Crawford's men opened up on the Japanese, killing 7 on the spot. 2 others ran off into the jungle, and 1 man was captured. As luck would have it, Colonel Uchi was the man captured. While Uchi was being led away by Sergeant Jack Mackenzie, a Japanese soldier playing dead rose up to take out the sergeant. Firing his carbine from the hip without letting go of his prisoner, Mackenzie shot his attacker in the head. Colonel Uchi became the highest-ranking Japanese officer captured under combat conditions prior to Japan's surrender. For their contributions to Uchi's capture, Sergeant Alphonsia Dillon received the Silver Star, while Sergeant Albert Morrison and Privates First Class Robert A. Evans and Elmer Sloan received Bronze Stars. With their commander in captivity, more than 600 other Japanese finally came out of hiding to surrender. The 93rd Division saw very little additional combat, but the men did make a contribution to victory in the Pacific. From April 10th to July 10, 1945, the division discharged and offloaded 311,552 tons of supplies and equipment, moved thousands of Allied troops from transports to staging areas and back to embarkation points, and improved harbor facilities, roads, and campsites. But there were still battles to be fought. While on Jolo Island in the Philippines Sulu Archipelago between Borneo and Mindanao on July 17, 1945, a patrol from Company I, 368th Regiment was ambushed by a Japanese force 3 times its size. With bullets flying everywhere, Staff Sergeant Leonard D. Dowden from New Orleans, Louisiana, moved his squad to within 30 yards of the Japanese, but was then cut down by enemy fire. Despite being gravely wounded, Dowden crawled forward alone to assault a machine gun position with grenades. Just as he was about to throw a grenade, a burst of fire killed him. The patrol was able to fight off the enemy attack with only 18 casualties. For the extraordinary heroism that cost him his life, Staff Sergeant Dowden posthumously received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. He was the only member of the 93rd Infantry Division to earn the DSC during the war. By war's end, The 93rd would advance as far as Mindanao and Leyte in the Philippines while under the command of Brigadier General Leonard R. Boyd. When official word of Japan's surrender came, since there was a shortage of fireworks, the rifles blazed away in celebration. Sergeant James Yancey, 369th Infantry Regiment, said the 93rd joined in the celebration. Then a white officer came over to Yancey's elated group and ordered them to cease firing. All of their weapons were confiscated. The white troops kept firing away with their celebrations. During their 2 years in the Southwest Pacific, the men of the 93rd accumulated 825 military awards for valor and meritorious service. 1 Distinguished Service Cross, 1 Distinguished Service Medal, 5 Silver Stars, 5 Legions of Merit, 686 Bronze Stars, and 27 Air Medals. The 93rd Infantry Division sailed home and was deactivated at their former port of departure, Camp Stoneman, California, on February 3, 1946. The American military was desegregated 2 years later by order of President Harry S. Truman. Once back on U.S. soil, many African American soldiers had mixed feelings about their wartime service. For some, their brief time in combat proved that they were just as capable as white soldiers. For others, returning to civilian status meant a return to racism, Jim Crow laws, institutionalized discrimination, and restrictions on their personal freedoms. As one 93rd Infantry Division veteran said, "I got through fighting in the PTO, Pacific Theater of Operations, and now I've got to fight in the STO, USA, Southern Theater of Operations in the United States.